This program is brought to you by Stanford University.
Those of us who have an active memory of the 1970s in Iran remember Fereydoun Farrokhzad as a singer, songwriter, and host in the popular Mikhak Noghrayi television show, which was broadcast for several years and made Fereydoun into one of the most successful personalities in Iranian television history. Less known than his works as a songwriter, composer, recording artist, and showmaster are his contributions to literature. These contributions include his own poetry written in Persian, translations of modern European poetry from French, English, and German, and his work as the organizer of the Farrokhzad Literary Award. This award was founded by Fereydoun shortly after his relocation to Iran in the late 1960s, and during the 1970s it developed into a landmark event, which was particularly taken seriously by politicized Iranian writers. Among the recipients of this award were people like Ahmad Shamlou, Jalal al-Ahmad, and Ismail Khoei. Toward the end of the 1970s and with the rise of the revolutionary movement, the award ceremony lost its popularity and was eventually discontinued by Fereydoun himself. Fereydoun initially observed the beginnings of the revolutionary movement with some degree of sympathy and even participated in aid initiatives like the collection of money and medicine for wounded victims of street demonstrations. After the change of power, however, he was shocked about the outbreak of violence against those who were accused of being agents of the old regime, and he distanced himself from the revolution very quickly. However, he also stayed in Iran until 1981. And in the summer of 1981, he left Iran illegally into Turkey, and with the support of the German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who personally endorsed his case and supported his application for asylum, he left Germany. He left Turkey, came to Germany, and then from there he moved on to Paris. And Paris, as you know, was in the early 1980s the international center of organized Iranian opposition. In Paris, he broke his silence after 2 years and started working again as a singer and showmaster, this time with a distinct anti-revolutionary agenda. During his years in exile, he lived in Paris, Los Angeles, Hamburg, and Bonn. He helped underage Iranian POWs, traveled to Iraq at least 3 times on behalf of UNICEF, and brought back dozens of these children with him to Europe. In the early 90s, he also played in Hushang Allahyari's feature film I Love Vienna. Since the mid-1980s, Fereydoun collaborated with a Paris-based royalist political organization. And at the end, he became one of the most prominent victims of the Islamic Republic's state terrorism, which under the presidency of Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani and under the Minister of Intelligence, Ali Fallahian, reached the historical peak. On the 6th of August 1992, he was stabbed to death and beheaded by 3 assassins in his apartment in the outskirts of Bonn. And the details of this murder case still remain unknown to the general public, as you probably know. Only 3 days after he was murdered, the German Office for Criminal Investigation and the Interpol showed up at the crime scene, and they never disclosed their findings. Their investigation never led to a trial in the style of the Mykonos trial. And well, according to members of the Farrokhzad family who had flown in from Iran and also from other parts of Germany, the investigations did lead to a positive identification of the assassins, but the government prevented the disclosure of this information. So in a way, Fereydoun was also a victim of the German government's policy of critical dialogue toward the Islamic Republic, which became very prominent under Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel at that time. And basically, in the interest of business relations, the German authorities overlooked certain misbehaviors of the Islamic Republic as long as the personal safety of German-born citizens was not threatened. The last years of Fereydoun's life, his political engagement in exile and even his possible relations to his own assassins are among the most enigmatic parts of his legacy. And the truth about the murder case will only be disclosed once the Islamic Republic ceases to exist and public access to the archives of the intelligence ministry is granted. And of course, when the Germans and other international organizations who were involved in the investigations finally disclose their findings. During the 11 years of his life in exile, from 1981 to 1992, Fereydoun published 2 volumes of poetry in Persian, which he published in Los Angeles and in Germany. But it appears that he never tried to write anything in a foreign language, although he could have. More than 25 years earlier, as a student in Germany, he had written poetry in German. And these poems were highly acclaimed in German-speaking countries of Europe. At that time, West Germany and East Germany, as well as Austria and Switzerland. News of his success at that time even traveled to Iran and were noted primarily by people who knew him because of his family name and because of Farrokh's fame. In 1964, Fereydoun published a poetry book named, in German, Andere Jahreszeit, or Another Season. And with this book, he became the 3rd German writing and widely published Iranian writer in the history of German literature. The 2 others who were before him were, first of all, Sirus Atabay. Sirus Atabay was raised and educated in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and then later in Switzerland. And the other person was Bozorg Alavi, who had lived in the Weimar era, in the Weimar Republic era, for over 10 years in Berlin and in Aachen, and he received his PhD in Aachen, went back to Iran, and then after February 1948, when the Tudeh party was banned, he left Iran and chose to live in East Germany. And he actually lived in East Germany from the beginning from the foundation of this state until the end. And Alavi, this is also something that most people don't know, did write in German as well, but only his Persian writing is known inside Iran or among Iranians. Fereydoun established contact to Atabay in Zurich and to Alavi in East Berlin when he was living as a student in Munich. And parts of Fereydoun's that one German poetry book were translated into Persian only 40 years after the publication of the book. at the same time by two different people, or two different groups, rather. One person who did it was Hossein Mansouri, the adoptive son of Farrokh, who was educated in Munich and still lives in Munich. I believe that he was here, as you guessed. And the other group was a team, basically, consisting of the poet Mani, Mirza Agha Askari, and another person named Dariush Marzban. But these translations into Persian were only published recently, perhaps 3 or 4 years ago. Apart from these translations, the content of this book, Another Season, was remained unknown to the Iranian public. Although Fereydoun mentioned it sporadically. For example, there's an interview with Jamshid Golmakani in the journal Sepidu Siyah, which I found. It's from the early 1970s, where he mentions this. When I started writing this paper, I decided to translate the book from German into English. And the handout that I have brought, obviously too many, contains a selection of these. Oh, I cannot walk far, so yeah. Of my own translations. In only one case, I've included the German original. And Fereydoun's own translation of the same poem in Persian. It is the text called, with the title, Die Perzerinnen, Persian women of Iran, which he himself translated as Zanan Sarzamin Man. It's the only text I know that has been published in Fereydoun's own Persian translation. Before I start discussing the book, I should recapitulate some general information about. Oh, yes. About his life in Germany and his involvement with German language and literature. After finishing high school in Tehran, first the French Razi school and then the Darul Funun, Fereydoun went to Germany in 1958. His older brother, Amir Masoud, had already moved to Munich in 1952, and he had studied medicine, and by 1958, Amir was done with his studies of medicine. He was married and established in Munich. So Fereydoun moved there because of his older brother. And in 1956, you may know that Farrokh also spent a short while in Munich on her during her European trip. She went to Munich from Rome, and while in Munich she learned German and translated a book of poetry from German into Persian, and this book was also discovered only recently in 1999 and published a few years ago. So at first, Fereydoun had to attend the language school like everybody else, and on weekends he worked at a farm in Versmold, which is a village in the vicinity of Bielefeld. So during the week he was studying language, and on weekends he was commuting between Munich and Bielefeld, which is in Lower Saxony, right, in Niedersachsen. And so he got a feeling of the rural and the city life. And because of most probably because of his talent, his musical ear, he learned German very quickly. Already as a high school student, he had developed an interest in music, and he had performed as a singer. Once he had fulfilled the language entry requirements, he was accepted into the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Munich. And he started studying political science at the Geschwister-Scholl Institute of the University of Munich. At the same time, I mean, since his first encounter with German language, he was also interested in German poetry. While he was studying political science, Hans Meyer, by the way, was his main tutor. Hans Meyer, who was a prominent professor of political science, and then later on went on to become a minister, a cabinet minister in the provincial government of Bavaria. And they were friends. Actually, in the poetry book, one of the longest poem is dedicated to Hans Meyer. At the same time, he started establishing contacts in the artists and writers milieu of Munich. And in 1962, while visiting an American writer who was a resident of Munich, he met his future wife, Anya Buczkowski. Anya Buczkowski, who was a writer, a poet, and an actress. Still is, actually. Lives in Munich. Anya was older than Fereydoun by a couple of years, and she had studied German literature, and she had a radio program in which she recited poetry on the Bayerische Rundfunk, on the provincial radio station. And they moved together in a large apartment, and which is known because of, they were very social, and many people know the beautiful and large apartment on the Hohenzollernstrasse. And Anya helped him with his interest in reading German poetry and also writing. And at around that time, he started publishing his German poems in various literary journals, and also in the literary supplement of the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is the major daily newspaper coming out of Munich. But also in KW, in the new period of KW, which started to be edited and published again in the early 1960s. And KW, the main content of the journal is in Persian, but there's always a German appendix in it. In 1963, the German author and literary critic Martin Walser chose 11 poems by Fereydoun and published them in the literary yearbook Vorzeichen 2, which he edited and where he presented major voices of contemporary German literature. And in the yearbook 1963, Fereydoun is presented along with 10 other German-born poets like Peter Hamm and others who are still around. In 1963, Fereydoun compiled a selection of his poems into a book manuscript and started searching for a German publisher. He only approached established publishing houses like the Surkamp Verlag, which had already published the Vorzeichen 2 anthology. So he was known to the editors of Surkamp. At the end, he came to an agreement with the Luchterhand Verlag in Neuwied and Berlin, which is nowadays it's owned by Random House. It's one of the major literary publishing houses. The afterword in this edition that came out in 1964 was written by Johannes Bobrowski, who is one of the most significant poets and prose writers in post-World War II German literature. While he was a student at the University of Munich, Fereydoun traveled frequently to Vienna and to Berlin and sat in lectures, mainly in political science, but especially in Berlin. He used to travel quite often to the eastern part of the city. And he established contact to Bobrowski, showed him his writings. Bobrowski became interested and then agreed to write the afterword. His relation or friendship with Bobrowski continued until the 2nd of September 1965, when Bobrovsky suddenly died. And they saw each other, and they also exchanged letters. And only 2 weeks ago, I managed to get a few copies of the letters that Fereydoun wrote to Bobrovsky from the National German Literary Archive in Marbach. And I've included one postcard and 2 letters by Fereydoun to Bobrovsky in the handout, in the final part of the handout. Oh yeah. Bobrovsky, I have to give you some information about him, because his person, I mean his profile became important for Fereydoun in the next years. He was born in 1917 in Tilsit in eastern Prussia, on the border to Lithuania. He was a member of the Protestant Bekennende Kirche, Church of Avowal, and was in contact with the clandestine resistance movement against the Nazis in the 1930s. He was drafted in 1939 and spent 12 years on the Western Front in France, and then in Poland and Russia. And he was captured by the Soviet army in 1945 and spent 4 years in a labor camp. After being released from the Soviet camp, he returned to Germany and decided to settle in East Berlin, although he was not a communist. He was a socialist Christian. And he started working as a professional editor for a couple of publishing houses that were connected with the East German Christian Democratic Union. It's the same party where Angela Merkel, the current Chancellor of Germany, came from. However, he published his books. The 2 German republics were established in October 1949. And Bobrovsky, and the wall was erected on the 13th of August 1961. He continued going back and forth between the 2 parts of Germany, and he published his works in the West as well as in the East. And he always refused to accept that the division of the country would eventually lead to the development of 2 different German literatures. The political situation in the 2 separated parts of Germany fascinated Fereydoun. He kept traveling from Munich to West Berlin, visiting East Berlin frequently, and contrasting his experience of the 2 contradicting socioeconomic orders in the 2 parts of the city. And his preoccupation with the German question, die Deutsch-Deutsche Frage, was reflected in his poetry book, Andere Jahreszeit, where one whole chapter is dedicated to this theme. It's the chapter with the title Experience, Erfahrung. The relationship to Bobrovsky had a strong impact on Fereydoun, who himself had radical Marxist affinities at that time. Before 1953, Fereydoun had been a member of the Tudeh youth organization. And during the early 1960s, he socialized with the Munich-based activists of the Confederation of Iranian Students, which had been founded recently. Among his friends were people like Mohsen Rezvani, Mehdi Khanbaba Tehrani, and Kurosh Lashai, who all 3 of them went on to become Maoists. Most probably under the impression of his dialogue with Bobrovsky, Fereydoun chose to write his master's thesis in political science about the state and the Protestant church in East Germany, in the GDR. I have a copy of his master's thesis. And after the MA, after finishing the MA cum laude with the best mark, he immediately started working on a PhD thesis with the title Marx, Engels, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and the Polish Question. After Farrokh's death in February 1967, he decided to return to Iran together with Anya, his wife, and their son Rustam, who had been born in 1966. and abandoned the PhD thesis, but he did work on it. And there are records of him as a research student at the Geschwister-Scholl Institute. Years later, when Anya and Rostam had returned to Germany from Iran, Fereydoun was living alone in his apartment in Tehran's Amirabad district. And he kept a large picture of Rosa Luxemburg in his living room. And I know people who visited him in that apartment. For example, Hadi Khorsandi, my dear friend, told me that the first time he was introduced to the person and the thoughts of Rosa Luxemburg was in that apartment by Fereydoun. 5 months after the publication of his poetry book, Fereydoun received the Literary Award of the city of Berlin. On this occasion, Bobrovsky came over from East Berlin and held the laudatio during the ceremony in the western part of the city. The book, Under Jahreszeit, consists of only 63 pages, including Bobrovsky's 3-page-long afterword. It starts with a dedication to Anya, which is curiously written in present perfect. Für Anya, ich habe sie geliebt. For Anya, I have loved her very much. The dedication is followed by a tanka by the Japanese poet Sasaki Nobutsuna. Whether or not a trace remains on the road, cautiously will I go my way. The book is divided into 4 chapters. The first chapter, Persian Thought, German Spoken, includes 18 texts. The second, Portrait of a Country, 9. The third one, Experience, 13. And the last one, Was ich noch sagen wollte, something else I wanted to say, just 1. The texts vary in their length between 5 lines and 29 lines. The first and second chapters mainly contain imagistic texts, while the texts in the third and fourth chapters are more abstract and convey ideas and views about political and historical events. The texts in the first chapter are without a concrete, named local reference. They express the sensory perceptions of a removed lyrical I, this lyrische Ich, who is confronted with a new habitat. The lyrical I does not perceive this new habitat as foreign or intimidating. It tries to get closer to it and to develop a home-like feeling, enjoying the gradual approximation and familiarity. It senses that in this habitat, light, darkness, natural color combinations, the air's consistency, scents, and tastes are different. These new sensations are translated into very minimalistic and intimate images. The lyrical I seeks refuge in nature and does not relate to the social realities in the new environment. Germany is not mentioned by name at all, although the texts seem to be about Germany. The naturalistic character of the whole chapter is apparent in the titles of the texts. Night is the predominant motif in at least 6 texts in the first and second chapters. The color black is mentioned 13 times throughout the book, more than any other color. Red is used 8 times in the third chapter only, with a symbolic political meaning. Blue is mentioned 6 times. Green and yellow or gold are mentioned 5 times. However, white, brown, pink, and purple are completely absent in the entire book. The detached attitude of the lyrical I is reflected in the motif of sleep in combination with the color black and with night. The distant and observant in the position of the lyrical I is reflected in the frequent use of the motifs of silence, schweigen, schweigsam, schweigend, etc. 7 times. with the eyes 11 times. And flying, the sky, clouds, wind, air, and birds are other related motifs that evoke the sensation of height, width, and volatility. The second chapter is a yearning reflection on the home country which the lyrical eye has left behind. In this chapter, Iran, or rather Persia, is mentioned by name several times. Naturalist lyrical elements are complemented by subtle political allusions. Visually and acoustically, Persia is associated with vastness, short rains, the scent of raspberries, garlands of light, clouds of dust, fields of wheat, the sound of crickets, the blue enamel of the sky, turquoise minarets, larks flying and swimming in the wind. The key color in this chapter is gray, as in the coal eyes of Persian women, or in curtains of dust, Staubfahnen. Expressions of homesickness and longing are connected with sounds and images of sobbing tears, the feeling of thirst, and the mood of desolation and abandonment. The image of the old home country is not idyllic. In the text Bekenntnis, avowal, the old country is, I quote, the land of shriveled roses and mute nightingales. The lyrical eye is, I quote, confused by visible violence. It goes away so as to no longer have to enchain its words. End of quote. Interestingly, the poem Die Perserinnen is dedicated to Bozorg Alavi. As I mentioned before, he chose to move to East Germany and stayed there basically until the end of his life. He pursued an academic career at the Humboldt University in East Berlin. And in Iran, he was a persona non grata. So at that time, dedicating a poem explicitly to a person like that was a meaningful gesture on behalf of Fereydoun. The third chapter deals with the realities in post-World War II Germany. Here, Fereydoun picks up historically and politically charged topics like denazification after 1945, the division of Germany, the Cold War, and the position of the two German republics within it, the arms race, the rearmament of Germany, the Berlin Wall, and the ways in which both German republics came into terms with their own Nazi past. All of these themes became canonical and repetitive over the following decades until the reunification of Germany in the early 1990s. However, when Fereydoun wrote about them, they had novelty value. The poem Wahrnehmung, Perception, is an ironic and cryptic commentary. It's included in the handout. It is an ironic and cryptic commentary about the erection of border installations and the deployment of East German border guards along the demarcation line between the two German republics. It's on page 5 of the handout, top left corner. But if you look at it, you wouldn't be able to tell. The factual references are not obvious at first sight. Perception. In the early morning of the 13th of August 1961, i.e. 3 years before Fereydoun's book was published, members of the Betriebskampfgruppen, the paramilitary groups of East Berlin factory workers, supported by the National People's Army, the NVA, and the People's Police, the FOPO, the Volkspolizei, secured the demarcation line between the Soviet-occupied socialist sector of Berlin and the capitalist British, American, and French sectors. While some of the troops were standing guard, Others brought in construction material, and within a few hours, they built what became known as the Berlin Wall. In the East German jargon, called antifaschistischer Schutzwall, or anti-fascist protection wall. Its function was, from the Eastern ruling party's point of view, to protect the GDR, the East German Republic, against revived fascists attacking it from the West. In the imagery of this poem, the red sentinels are the East German border guards. In the German original, the composed noun Schildwache is used. And the word Schildwache is etymologically related to the Middle High German Schildwacht, in French sentinelle or factionnaire. A Schildwache is a guard positioned in front of a checkpoint and empowered to use his weapon against anybody who refuses to abide by the state's order and authority. A Schildwache is not allowed to let go of his weapon, leave the post, speak, eat, or drink unless ordered to do so. In the poem, Schildwachen, or sentinels, grow out of the vertices, i.e., appear out of nowhere along the demarcation line. Their intimidating image is contrasted sarcastically with the affectionate ways of the West. The poem seems to qualify the building of the Berlin Wall as a necessary measure to contain the escalating East-West conflict. Essentially, the wall prevents the outbreak of war, even though it upsets some neighbors, as you see in the last 3 lines. The poem debunks Western religious values like brotherly love and declares them as hypocrisy, at least implicitly. The reference to shop windows and blue jeans merchants are related to West Berlin, the colorful shop window of Western capitalism, where American-style consumer goods inundated the market. The latent anti-consummation discourse of this poem became prominent only a few years later, in 1968, in the student movement in Germany. Radical student groups actually attacked the KaDeWe, the Kaufhaus des Westens, big department store, and set fire to it. Some activists in the extreme fringes of this movement, like Andreas Bader and Ulrike Meinhof, even took the same political agenda further and formed terrorist organizations. I should add that by 1968, Fereydoun himself no longer had any leftist affinities. In June 1967, when the Shah of Iran visited Berlin, a large number of Iranian and German students were mobilized by the Confederation of Iranian Students and the SDS, the main German student organization, and demonstrated against him. In clashes with members of the Iranian security forces who had been flown in a separate airplane, and the West Berlin police, one German student named Benno Ohnesorg was shot dead. So this was a big scandal. While the majority of Iranian students were sympathetic toward the demonstration and demonstrators, Fereydoun was one of the few who actually went to the airport and welcomed the arrival of the Shah and Farhat Diba with a bundle of flowers. So, in other words, his political views had changed drastically between 1964 and 67. In the poem Diesseits und Jenseits, on this side and on the other side, the phrase "republic made to the old measure" refers to both successor states of the German Reich that try to come to terms with their common past, with what the poem symbolizes as whips and caresses. The GDR caressed the anti-fascist heritage of the communist and social democrat movement, but also claimed the humanistic tradition in German history, all the way back to the 15th century. It treated the militaristic, authoritarian, racist, and chauvinist tradition in Germany's history with a whip. The West German Republic saw itself in continuation of the liberal tradition of the Weimar Republic, primarily, which was destroyed by the left and right extremists. In this poem, only the East German flag logo with the hammer and circle is depicted, and the Western, the federal eagle, the Bundesadler, is absent. All the way to the end of the text, the implied narrator refuses to take sides. An implied you is addressed. Do not believe your republic is better than his. Do not believe your republic is better than his. Believe only every other word. The reference to the old hairstyle on this side and on the other side implies that both emerging separate nations are, despite their present differences, held together by the burden of a common inglorious past. The poem, by the way, is, as I mentioned before, dedicated to Hans Meyer, who at that time, I believe, was already a minister, a cabinet minister in Bavaria. The poet himself is part of the West German political texture. Texts like the atom bomb, I don't think it's included in the handout, in chapter 3, reflect the pacifist discourse of the Western peace movement from the 1950s until the end of the Cold War. In the last strophe of the last poem of the book, with the title Unheard, which is included in the handout, Fereydoun depicts an image of his own death that occurred 28 years later. He speaks of songs coming out of headless bodies of birds. Fereydoun himself was a singing bird, and he was beheaded by his assassins. Incidentally, the very last poem that Farrokh wrote, only 2 days before her death in February 1967, was Tanha Sedas ke mimanad. And in the very last 2 lines of this last poem that she wrote, she also used the motif of the mortal bird, as you know. Parvaz ra be khater bespar, parande murdani ist. Throughout the book, the predominant poetic technique is imagism. All poems are rhymeless with irregular rhythms. Perhaps the most important stylistic feature of this book is the simplicity of its images and words, the clarity of its syntax, and as a result, the fluidity of the texts. Fereydoun's ability to contain deep thoughts and complex, intimate life experiences into sober and unostentatious words and images are indicative of a certain degree of maturity which he attained at an early stage of his creative life. The development took place in him within a few years after his arrival in Germany, and even surprised his sister, Farrokh, who was in permanent correspondence with him. If you look at the page with the Persian, page number 7 in the handout, the top section, that's what I'm referring to. Sorry, the second one. شعرهایت به خصوص این آخری‌ها عالی بودن، جدا عالی. من تعجب میکنم و از خود میپرسم تو این هوشیاری etc. etc. Fereydoun regularly sent Farrokh samples of his writings in German and in draft translations into Persian. If you look at the first section on page 7, it appears that, because she says اما نمیدونم در زبان آلمانی چه حالتی ممکن است داشته باشند. It suggests that what Farrokh was reading was a draft translation in Persian. Although she was able to read German, as I mentioned before, she had learned it. I have not been able to find any trace of these of the letters by Fereydoun, or rather these draft translations. Nobody knows where they are. I have inquired. I asked his sister, Puran Khanum, in Tehran, and impossible, unfortunately. Fereydoun regularly sent Farrokh samples of his writings in German. He discovered the aesthetic of simplicity that Farrokh sought in her later work after Tavallud Digar very early on and through writing in German. So he was younger, but he was ahead of her in a way. In her letters to Fereydoun, Farrokh suggested to him to apply the same aesthetic concept and write Persian poems without worrying about the formalities of rhyme and meter. I have included, it is the first section on page 7. The main issue was the originality of his conception of the world. She spoke of the necessity to sacrifice oneself for the cause of poetry. That is in the last section on page 7. Sorry. اگر بخوای شاعر باشی خودت راش قربانی شعر کن, etc. She reminded him of his luck to be in the healthy intellectual and artistic environment of Munich. Fereydoun did not follow Farrokh's poetological advice. In his later poems written in Persian, which he published after the revolution and in exile, he returned to the more rigid classical forms and wrote masnavis and ghazals. His interest in classical Persian literature, and particularly in Maulana, may be explained with his often expressed view that these aspects of Iranian culture and soul were timeless. They were bound to survive what he regarded as the disgraceful chapter of the Islamic Republic in Iran's history. He regarded Hafez and Maulana as allies in his personal cultural war against theocracy. In the years after the publication of An der Jahreszeit, Fereydoun explored his other talents and did not follow his sister's advice to sacrifice himself to the cause of poetry either. From 1965 on, he spent increasingly more time writing songs and composing music. He even received the first prize of the music festival in the Austrian city of Innsbruck, in Mozart and Schubert's country. Under the name Fereydoun, he recorded at least one LP and pursued a career as a stage artist in live events and in German radio and television shows. Two of his German songs, which he recorded in the mid-1960s, were released during the 1970s in Iran on an album named Fereydoun Farrokhzad va Khateraha. While he was a student at the University of Munich, he produced a documentary film series about mountain roads in the European Alps for the Bavarian television. And by the end of the 1960s, he had become such a colorful and glamorous personality that the Hollywood-based filmmaker Tracy Alban made a documentary film about him, showing his life, his public life, and his personal life in Iran and in Germany. And Tracy Alban is around. He's in Los Angeles. He's originally German. And parts of this documentary have been uploaded by somebody to YouTube. You can watch it if you punch in Fereydoun Farrokhzad on YouTube. You will see some of it, not all of it. From today's point of view, the poetry book An der Jahreszeit seems to have completed a certain episode in Fereydoun's life. Writing poetry in German was his way of grasping the new world he had entered and helped him search for his place in it. Thank you. Yes.
So he arrives in Germany in
58.
And he stays there till when?
Probably 69, 68, 69.
And he doesn't finish the PhD?
No. He passed the MA in 65. So it took him from 60 to 65 to do the MA. Yeah.
The date of the book is 63?
64.
64.
Yes, because she says that خبرت را مرتب در روزنامه میخوانم، معلوم میشه کارت خیلی بالا گرفته، 2 سال است با آلمانی شعر میگویی etc. I'm pretty sure because Hossein actually told me, Hossein Mansouri Farrokh's son, that he saw the book as a child while he was at home with Farrokh. Please.
I'm really interested in this notion of a friendship between Fereydoun, Farrokhzad and Bobrovsky. Because if you had said two literary figures of the 20th century who were on their kind of the public persona, what one normally thinks of those two as being like, who were less likely to be friends, I'd be hard put to come up with a couple. Because he seems, Farrokhzad, I only know him by his kind of later persona, which is obviously quite different from what he was like as a young man. It's all kind of glamour and glory and publicity and a certain narcissism and cosmopolitanism. And Bobrovsky seems so rooted and obsessed with the Germanness of being German and German history and the guilt of German history and all that. It seems so local and so deeply serious. And Farrokhzad seems so utterly skittish, at least in the later manifestations of his personality. And I just wonder how these two came together. And I can see what Farrokhzad might have seen in Bobrovsky, because he seems to be somebody who just sought fame, and Bobrovsky was famous. But whatever did Bobrovsky see in Farrokhzad when he was a young man who could hardly published anything? And I'm just very intrigued by how this clearly very important relationship with Farrokhzad came about, and what there was that drew them together.
I think Bobrovsky saw the little boy that was hiding inside, this public persona, and the little boy comes through in the German poems, and later on is suppressed, probably more or less. But I mean, he simply liked the poems and decided to write. And I think somebody should. I have asked Random House for permission to translate Bobrovsky's afterword, and to publish it. It's just 3 pages long, but it's very, very interesting also.
Yeah, I would love to see it.
What does it say?
He says that he admires the fact that Fereydoun doesn't respect traditions and breaks rules, creates images and combines words, comes up with composed nouns, etc. Probably because nobody with the burden of tradition would dare to do it, but only somebody coming from outside has the courage. This is one of the things he says. And then he also praises the balance between deep thoughts and simplicity of expression.
Which Bobrovsky does have.
Yes.
Great simplicity with kind of profundity at the same time.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what we... Do you know if he ever came across Matthew Mead, who was Bobrovsky's English translator, and was very close to Bobrovsky at that time? Do you know if Fereydoun ever knew him?
No. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find or to get access to Bobrovsky's letters to Fereydoun. They are either in Fereydoun's house in Tehran, and Puran's daughter lives there, Afsaneh. She has access to his personal items that he left behind in 81, and including a bundle of letters. But she wasn't. I mean, I wasn't able to get anything. And Anya Buchkovsky, his wife, may have them, but she is not interested in establishing contact or discussing Fereydoun with anybody.
Do you know, I don't want to monopolize, but nobody else is asking. Do you know anything more about his relationship with Cyrus Ataban? Were they very close, or was it just casual?
Atabay came from Zurich to Munich. But then in the 1960s, he also commuted between Munich and London. You know, he had a place in Belsize Park, and he was friends with Canetti and Erich Fried, etc. So while he was in Munich, they saw each other, and they also exchanged writings, but no details as far as I know. Atabay was Atabay was really discovered in 1958, so he was not that famous at that time. He was discovered in 1958 by Max Richner in the Zurich journal Die Tat, together with Paul Celan. And yes, it's a piece by Richner where he introduces Atabay together with Celan, and so he was relatively unknown. But Atabay did travel back to Iran, and he had relations to Farrokh. And there is a letter where Farrokh recommends to Fereydoun to hang out with Atabay more and help him translate her poetry into German, because she thought that his Persian may not be good enough, perhaps.
Another connection is Golestan, because Golestan was very close friend with Atabay. And knew him, knew the poetry, and knew his value, and became sort of his advocate amongst the intelligentsia.
Yeah.
Because he was, Atabay was sort of unknown, and many didn't like him because he was Shah's relative.
Nephew, I think, yeah. Yes. Yeah. I have a comment on that, but I don't want to, Professor Momsen, please.
My question was also about his relationship to Atabay, because I knew him from his childhood on, and he was such a different person from Bobrovsky and
Yes.
the others you mentioned. So I'm interested.
Yeah. Not much is known. I mean, apart from a few references and also eyewitness reports. Mehdi Tehrani knew both of them in Munich. I mean, he knows the entire world, but because he lived in Munich at the time, and he had relations with Atabay and with Fereydoun. He also confirmed that Atabay read Fereydoun's writings, etc.
So I have a question.
Yes.
First of all, I want to say that when I was a child in Iran, I saw probably all of the Mikhail shows. And Fereydoun was a neighbor of ours. He was very close where we lived. So I'd seen him a few times in the street. He had a huge dog, too, at the time. Two things that come to mind. He has a song about Anya that he used to sing on the show. And also one about his son, that they're going to basically lose their home or part of the Ashia. My question is, do you know the whereabouts of Rostam Farrokhzad?
Yeah, he's in Munich. Yes, he was born in late 1966, so he's 42 years old. They also had a daughter, Ophelia, who died as a baby. And Rostam is very ill, so he lives with his mother.
Physically?
He's mentally handicapped, but he was always, since he was a child, yeah.
Handicap or depressed?
No, he's handicapped, yeah. Yeah, but about the Golestan connection, as far as I know, Atabay's work was only translated into Persian in the late 1960s. There's a book called Dar Wadi Shaparakha, which is a selection of his early writings. And one of the first people who wrote about Atabay was Barahani. There is a chapter in Taladarmes about Sirus Atabay and this book. And before that, before the late 1960s, I don't know how people would have been able to read his work.
was very close to Fereydoun and made a lot of connections to the European learning. But I know that he knew him well, he knew Ottawa well. And have you talked to Gulistan about him?
Fereydoun, no. I should.
I think you should.
Yes.
I think it'll be an interesting angle.
Yes.
You know, I had absolutely no idea. My knowledge of him was the way Professor Davis talked about it. So I was this flippant guy who then decided to become political and paid a heavy price. But this serious side of it.
That's a revelation.
It's really a revelation.
Yeah.
Can you
Yes.
tell us the name of the documentary again and the filmmaker?
Tracy Albon. It's Tracy and then Albon.
And the name of the film is just about Farrokhzad
Yeah.
or something.
You can search it. It's quite easy.
And the collection of his poetry in German, has it translated to Farsi?
Yes.
Totally?
Not completely, but as I mentioned, Hossein Mansouri, who was Farrukh's adoptive son and lives in Munich, he translated some of it. And then a poet who lives in Bochum, Germany, also did Mirza Agha Askari or Mani. Mani also edited a book called, with the title Khonyagar dar Khun, about Fereydoun.
When was that?
The first edition came out in 2001, and the second edition came out through Kitab Corporation in Los Angeles last year. In that book, there are contributions by a number of people who knew him. Sometimes very short. For example, Iraj Jannati Atai, who wrote at least 11 songs for Fereydoun when he returned to Iran. He lives in London, and he wrote a piece for that book, and others who were close to him or friends with him. Yeah.
Do you have any idea about this last stage, how he became political, and why he chose that particular persona for the last stage of his life? Because he clearly had options, other options.
Yes, I think he had. I should probably turn this off. Ambitions to become a leader, even, and using his popularity. I mean, it's a fact. In 1982-83, he had a couple of public appearances in the Royal Albert Hall in London, and there were 5,000 people sitting there. Very rare. Giving a speech, singing, all kinds of things. It was a variety show.
You mean he thought of himself as a potential political leader?
Yes. But he was disappointed because people did not follow him. And even, he belonged to the royalist camp. And even the royalists did not treat him well.